Now, here let's move into how President Nixon's war on drugs reshaped the Internal Revenue Code. America and cannabis have a well-documented industrial and medicinal relationship. Around 1611, colonist farmers cultivated America's first cannabis crop and used the plant as fiber for rope and clothing. By the 1850s, cannabis was a patent medicine available in United States pharmacies, where it remained a staple for over 60 years. In 1906, Congress passed the Federal Food and Drug Act, which is one of the nation's first efforts to regulate commercial drugs, food, and dietary supplements. Now, this act allowed the U.S. Department of Agriculture to ensure the safe use of cannabis through its Bureau of Chemistry. However, by the early 1920s, cities and states in the South began prohibiting the use of cannabis. Now, in many of these states, the rationale was racially motivated. This is well documented in many books I've read and many legal scholars have cited. Lurid newspaper headlines promoted the alleged dangers of cannabis, swept the nation, and led to the establishment of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was an agency used to warn Americans about the alleged perils of pot. Public concern about illegal drug use rose in the 30s due to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics media campaign that warned Americans of the alleged perils of cannabis. In 1930, Congress renamed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics into the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which is an agency we all know and love in the industry and became the new regulatory body for drugs in the United States. Now, in 1937, Representative Robert Doughton of North Carolina responded to the public's concern when he introduced House Bill 6385. House Bill 6385 sought to stamp out the adult use of cannabis by imposing a prohibitive tax on the plant. House Bill 6385 was challenged. First, Fiorello LaGuardia, then mayor of New York City, formed a committee to study the effects of cannabis. The committee published the LaGuardia Report, which concluded that cannabis was not addictive and was not motivating into major crimes and was not common among children. Second, in a legislative hearing, the American Medical Association opposed the bill when it argued that the proposed bill would severely hamper physicians' ability to utilize cannabis's therapeutic potential. Now, despite the LaGuardia Report and the American Medical Association's protest, Franklin Roosevelt signed the Marijuana Tax Act into law, which ushered in the federal government's venture into the criminal enforcement of cannabis laws. The 1960s, almost 30 years after the passage of the federal cannabis prohibition, brought dramatic social change to the United States, and in many ways, cannabis was at the center of it. This counterculture movement centered on freedom, civil rights, and peace. Drugs specifically, crystallized all the negatives of the counterculture due to its presence in music and widespread use among young adults. Cannabis struck uneasiness in parents, local law enforcement, and likely triggered President Nixon's focus on substance abuse during his presidency. In 1971, with the goal to stop drug use in the United States, President Nixon declared a war on drugs. As part of his war on drugs, President Nixon enacted the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which has lasting effects on today's United States cannabis market. Title II of this act, also known as the Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, serves as the legal foundation for the government's war on drugs. The act created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, to enforce the CEA and determine how certain drugs and substances will be regulated. The Controlled Substances Act also categorized drugs into and substances into classifications. But rather than leaving the classifications of drugs to the FDA or scientific community, Congress categorized the substances into 5 schedules based on the drugs or substances' medicinal value and potential for abuse. Schedule 1 drugs are considered to be the most dangerous because they have a high potential for abuse and have no currently accepted medical use in the United States. Congress classified cannabis, LSD, and heroin as Schedule 1 drugs. Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential for abuse, but have an accepted medical use in the United States. Now, of course, we've seen the medical application of cannabis across time, but I'm just going through the classifications as the federal government sees it. So, as I mentioned, Schedule 2 drugs also have a high potential for abuse, but according to the government, they have an accepted medical use. Cocaine is a Schedule 2 drug. Schedule 3 drugs have a lower potential for abuse and have a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 4 drugs have an even lower potential for abuse and a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 5 drugs are considered to be the least dangerous because they have the lowest potential for abuse and also have a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 5 drug substances are typically over-the-counter medicines, for example, cough medicines, or with small amounts of codeine. Now, the classification of cannabis as a Schedule 1 drug was intended to be temporary, actually, because the Controlled Substances Act also called for the creation of a federal commission to study cannabis. After 2 years of research, Congress's Cannabis Commission, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, rebutted negative claims about cannabis. Now, speaking before Congress, the commission's chairperson at the time, Republican Governor Raymond Schaefer of Pennsylvania, actually recommended that Congress decriminalize cannabis, quote, because of the little proven danger of physical or psychological harm, and that cannabis should no longer be classified as a Schedule 1 drug. So the CSA said, hey, listen, these are our classifications. We're going to have it temporary, and let's reconvene and see what our research shows. So Mr. Schaefer came back and said, hey, listen, there's no proven danger of physical or psychological harm, and cannabis doesn't need to be scheduled this tightly. Of course, President Nixon did not adopt the commission's recommendation, thus keeping cannabis under the lovely Schedule 1 controlled substance classification we have today. Now, the Controlled Substances Act expanded government power over the regulation of drugs on all levels. State legislators expanded on the federal initiative and utilized the CSA scheduling system to update their criminal statutes in accordance with the CSA. With the DEA empowered and the most comprehensive prohibition of substances in American history enacted into law, future presidents would rely heavily on the DEA and the CSA to boost their tough-on-crime, tough-on-drug initiatives. In August of 1974, President Nixon resigned, but the war on drugs raged on. Throughout the 1980s, public concern about drug use built, largely due to media portrayals of people addicted to smokable forms of cocaine, which they dubbed crack. This concern set up President Ronald Reagan's expansion of Nixon's war on drug policy soon after President Reagan took office in 1981. President Reagan took numerous approaches to deter drug use, mostly through no-tolerance criminal statutes like mandatory prison sentencing for simple possession. But President Reagan also combated drug trafficking through federal taxation.